Hey everybody, I'm Brian. Welcome back to BellTube. Today's video is entitled The Fantasy Books That Lit My Path. Now, before I even get into what this video is about, I have to shout out Mike from Mike's Book Reviews because he did a very similar video. One might even say I'm copying him. Apologies to Mike, but I did ask his permission first, so I really wanted to do this today. And this is going to be a video about some books that I read in my very formative years that kind of turned me into the person that I think that I am today, or at least they were good guideposts along the way. Now, here's the thing about this video. I have very little time to make it. I have even less time to edit it. So you've asked for edit-free videos. Today you're going to get an edit-free video, probably loaded with mistakes and glitches, and who cares? Let's just talk about this. So the books that I've got lined up today cover material that I read starting when I was 5 years old, all the way up to when I was 25 years old. So you may be asking yourself, but Brian, you only look 26 years old. Have you only read a year's? Oh, come on, you guys, obviously not. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make this part one of an ongoing series. That's how I'm differentiating myself from, some of the other BookTube stuff about this, is that I just want this to be part one. We're talking the formative years here. And I think if this video, is well received, what I'm likely to do is talk more about books that I read in my 20s and 30s and my 30s and 40s and beyond, and kind of what shaped me. That was a very long intro. Let's get into the books. And I think just before I get into the books, I want to say that comic books played a gigantic role in my life, and they were very, very informative to me on the kinds of stories that I liked being told. So from the time I was about 7 years old, I read everything with the Spider-Man name on it till I was probably about 30. Everything Defenders, Doctor Strange, The Avengers. I was mostly kind of a Marvel Comics guy, but at the same time, there were some DC comics that I really liked. I loved Justice League of America, the JLA, and I really liked all the Batman comics. So that said, keep that kind of in the back of your mind, that comic books were a consistency throughout this list. Now, I did mention that these are all fantasy books. I kind of lied. Two of them are not. One's a science fiction book, and three of them are not. One's a science fiction book, one is kind of a self-help book, and one of them is a little bit more of a business book. And we're going to talk about all of these in the order that I read them. So let's get in our time machine and go back to the year 1975, when yours truly was just 5 years old. And I read The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. Now you can tell this book is pretty torn apart. Poor Shel here on the back, but this is my original copy. The Giving Tree is a huge book for me. I'm going to kind of throw these books off to the side, so if I go in and out of microphone, I apologize. Giving Tree is a huge book for me. I think at the beginning, I loved the fantasy aspect of it, that there was this sentient tree, and the tree could talk, and there was this boy, and the tree was giving all this stuff to the boy. And I feel like in some regard, my life has kind of been both the boy and the tree. So early on in life, I feel like I was much more of a taker. And if people wanted to give things to me, I was there to take them. I wasn't that big of a giver. And sometime later in life, it was probably about my mid-30s, where I found myself kind of reminded that, I think I'm turning into the tree here, where I'm giving everything of myself and maybe not getting anything in return, or certainly not asking for anything in return. So that story has really impacted me in a couple of different ways. The first being, this is really cool. I love this story about a tree that loves this boy so much that the tree is willing to essentially give all of itself for the comfort of this boy as he becomes a young adult, as he becomes an adult, and of course he becomes elderly at the end. And yeah, obviously this is a child's book. This was written in 1967. But it really made an impact on me, and it started to kind of get me on this journey about literature, kind of giving me an idea of how I wanted to go about living my life. Even though the fact that I read it when I was 5, I probably wasn't consciously processing that, right? I wasn't saying, oh, this book is going to, guide me down the path of life. No, it was a guidepost to set me sort of on a course, and for that I'm very grateful. let's get into a little bit more of what we would call classic fantasy. So in 1980, 81, and 1982, an author by the name of Piers Anthony put out a trilogy called the Apprentice Adapt Trilogy. And book 1, I've got right here, it's called Split Infinity. Book 2 was 1981. This is the year I read them, by the way. As they came out, it was called Blue Adept. And book 3 is called Juxtaposition, and this came out in 1982. So yeah, 80, 81, and 82 is when I read these books, and these are newer copies, actually, even though they are mass market paperbacks. I have my originals off camera, but they're so beat up from, literally, I read these books 50 years ago. So what was it, 50 years ago? Can I do basic math? I don't know. You guys tell me in the comments how my math skills are. Anyway, what did I like about this series? Well, first, let's talk about the author, Piers Anthony, because he's very divisive. It's turned out later in life he might have been quite the misogynist. He has a lot of kind of issues, and so I'm not out here, on my pedestal talking about how great of a guy Piers Anthony is. But what this video is about are the books that sort of drove me to fantasy. And he was really more known for his Xanth series, and that's spelled with an X, X-A-N-T-H. It was his big series, and the first book was called A Spell for Chameleon. And I read it, and I liked it, but it didn't really put its hooks in me the way that Split Infinity did in this first book of the trilogy. The setting and the premise is basically there are two parallel worlds, and one is all very technologically based. It's like a sci-fi world. The other one is complete fantasy where magic rules. And people live in both of these worlds, and they essentially have a doppelganger. They have a clone of themselves in each world. Thus, they can't go into the other world unless their doppelganger, their opposite, is no longer alive. And we get this mystery that somehow our guy who starts off in the world of Proton, which is the sci-fi world, is able to cross into the world of Phase, which is the magical world, because his copy on that side has been murdered. And it's just a really cool book. I didn't know that I liked sci-fi back then. I knew I liked fantasy, and I was getting into fantasy more, but that book series just absolutely stuck with me. And I think it really was the first actual trilogy that I read, come to think about it. So what a guidepost, right? The first trilogy that I read in fantasy, and something that stuck with me that I love to this day, regardless of the author. And I think along with that, let's talk about the next one. Same author, Piers Anthony. This is 1983's On a Pale Horse. And this is book 1 in a 7-book series called The Incarnations of Immortality. Now, On a Pale Horse is all about the incarnation of death. And in this particular world, different incarnations are formed by essentially humans. And this guy gets a knock at the door, and it's someone telling him, hey, you're going to be the next incarnation of death. And that's what this book is about. And as we get into the series, I grabbed another book here. I think this is book 2. This is called Bearing an Hourglass. This is the guy that is told that he's going to be the incarnation of time. And I just love the aspects of this where human beings like us were given this power, life over death, or the incarnation of time. And in this particular book, this guy's living his life in reverse, and he's going backwards in time. And it'll all make sense as the series goes on. I wanted to show this because I do have this one only in paperback. The rest of the series I do have back behind me in hardback, I should say. And by the way, if you guys ever want me to do, my voice just cracked. If you guys ever want me to do a shelf tour, let me know in the comments, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, before we get into the next big series, of course, I'm going to ask you, please do like the video, hit the thumbs up button. It helps the channel grow more than you know, and it lets more people, find out about BellTube in the first place. Also, subscribe to the channel. Click that subscribe button. It does help us a ton, and we are really getting close to 5,000 subscribers, and I promised everybody a very special video once we hit 5,000. For some of you who've been around since day one, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we are on the path to 5,000. If you subscribe, you will help us along the path. Let's get back to the books. And this one I read when it was released in 1984. And you guys know what this is probably. This is the Dragonlance Chronicles. Dragons of an Autumn Twilight, Book 1, 1984. Yeah, this is, Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. These are kind of the founding mothers in some regard of D&D fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons fantasy is what I'm talking about. And I just fell in love with essentially these character classes because I was a D&D player back in 1984, right? The game, it just kind of came out a little bit, and my friends would come over to the basement and I would DM and we would just have a good time. But this was really cool. I learned about paladins and I learned about a wizard, and to this day, I couldn't tell you what happened in that book, but I know that the wizard's name was Raistlin. That I know. That is locked into my brain forever. And so what I got out of Dragonlance Chronicles as a guidepost was, all right, not only do I like trilogies, not only do I like fantasy, I like this idea of epic fantasy, where there's a party, there's a war band, there's a group that gathers to go on some quest and do whatever they're going to do. That's really the first book series that I read that involved questing and just character growth and development. So a big guidepost on my way that lit my fantasy path, for sure, Dragonlance Chronicles. All right, speaking of something else that really close to it, this came out in 1977. I read this book, I'm going to say probably 1984-ish, maybe 1985. This is Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara, right? So the Shannara books. This is classic epic fantasy. It does not get any more classic epic fantasy, really, outside of Tolkien than when you start talking about the Shannara books. And now we're starting to get into elves and dwarves and magical crystals and learning spells and just a bunch of cool stuff that, to this day, I mean, this is my original copy. You guys, my eyes are so bad, there's no way I could possibly read this. I do have the other Shannara books back behind me on the shelf. But yeah, for sure, Shannara. Big influence, big guidepost along my fantasy path. Let's take a step outside of fantasy for a second. Now, this book was published in 1979. I read it in 1985. And this is the one that I said was a science fiction book, and maybe you'll get a little bit of my sensibilities when you see what this cover is and what this title is. Maybe you already know. It's Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I didn't know how much I needed satire in my life until I was 15 years old and read this book. You got to remember, when you're 15 years old, unless you are, encouraged by a family member to read, or you have a passion for reading like I did when, I was a kid, you're reading stuff that's basically assigned to you, right, by your teachers. And I assure you, in 1985, nobody was assigning this book to be read, or anything like it. So for me, this was so different and new. Like, I knew I liked science fiction, but what I didn't, my voice just cracked again, by the way. I knew I liked science fiction, but I didn't know how funny it could be. Now, of course, it would take me all the way until probably Terry Pratchett to find somebody who made me laugh out loud as much as Douglas Adams does, in these books. And this is really the highlight of the series for me. To me, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as a standalone book is just indomitable. It's fantastic. The series itself, as it goes on, meanders a lot, doesn't do anything for me as much as this book did. But again, we're talking guideposts. And here I started finding out I really like funny books. And I like clever authors. And this was the first clever author that I ever read. Now we are going to get into... this one I don't have. So I have to talk about a book that I'm going to put right here because I loaned it to somebody years ago and she never gave it back. And the sad part is she hated the book. So anyway, this next book is the one that I was talking about is kind of more of a self-help book. That's what they called them back in the day. A little bit of new age. Today they'd probably be called personal development books. And this is by author Richard Bach. And the book is called Illusions: The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah. Now, the premise of this book is basically Richard Bach is a discouraged author, and he's taken to flying, small planes throughout basically the Midwest. And this is actually something he's done in real life. And he meets this guy named Donald Shimoda, which he doesn't realize is a self-proclaimed Messiah. And through the book, we get a lot of life lessons. And I know they're kind of dime store, psychological, pick-me-ups, and a little bit of my one for the road stuff comes from those types of discussions that, discussions is kind of even too big of a word for that, just thoughts and ideas and concepts that come in the book Illusions. But when I read this book, I think it was in 1992, so I was 22 years old when I read it. And for me, it absolutely worked, because while I was, raised in a certain religion in and of itself has never called to me, but spirituality has. And what this book gave me for the first time was almost like a fantastical setting where somebody is essentially a mechanic messiah for the most part, and talking about life's lessons that are all very spiritual in nature that I'd never found before. And it absolutely informed the person that I would become. I read that in 1992. Again, Illusions: The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by Richard Bach. Read it if you like. You might like it. You might find it to be utterly stupid. I don't know. But I know at the time and the place that I was when I was 22, when I read that book, it was hugely meaningful to me. Let's move on, and we're getting back into epic fantasy here. Now, this couldn't be better timing, because The Broken Binding just released, or is about to release, an incredible edition of Raymond E. Feist's The Magician series. Now, this happens to be Magician's Apprentice. Yes, I've had this book that long because now they put it out as one book just called Magician, but it was first Magician Apprentice, then Magician Master. I've got Master right there on the bookshelves behind me. But this was really cool. We're talking about parallel worlds here. We are talking about a rift war, a war between these worlds, and a coming-of-age story of our guy Pug here on his way to become a magician. This was cool. This was what I hoped that I was going to, I'm not of the age where a lot of you viewers are that got to grow up with Harry Potter, right? And you were always hoping that you'd get that letter from Harry Potter, right? When you were a young kid and go to Hogwarts. This, for me, was like what I was hoping when I was a kid. I want to become a magician's apprentice and learn all this stuff. So here's the interesting thing about why I consider this to be a guidepost. I have read at least 18 books in the Rift War world, in Raymond E. Feist's world, that started with this one, Magician Apprentice. 18 books. That is a ton of books. I didn't know at the time. And again, I think I read this back in 1993. It was published in 1992. I read it really quickly because the title alone just grabbed me and I gravitated to it and read it right away. And this was really, when we talk about guideposts, this was getting me into long series. I didn't know I needed those in my life. Since then, we've hit, the Wheel of Time. We've hit Realm of the Elderlings, two of the biggest ones that are out there. And it all started with the Raymond E. Feist book. That's why that's on this list. Now, bonus book. This has nothing to do with fantasy, sci-fi, or lit RPG. And I am going to talk about lit RPG in the next video that I do on this because it happened a little bit later in life. But when I was 25 years old, I wanted to, well, to be honest with you, I wanted to be rich. I wanted to figure out how to make a lot of money. I had no idea how. And I was encouraged to read this book. It's a classic. This was written in 1937. It's called Think and Grow Rich. This is the trade paperback. I actually have my original mass market paperback behind me. This is written by Napoleon Hill. This was commissioned by Andrew Carnegie, who I think may have been America's first billionaire. I don't know. It's something like that. But he commissioned this guy, Napoleon Hill, to go around and interview the wealthiest people of the day in the United States and figure out if they shared any similar traits, and then put it into a book that the average person could read and learn from some of the most successful people out there what traits they all seem to have in common. Now, there are a lot of traits back then that are pretty rotten traits, but the ones that made it into this book are excellent. And I do recommend this book for people that kind of have this desire for some financial freedom, and it's a really good starting place. Think and Grow Rich is a classic. It's almost 100 years old now, and I want to just talk about chapter 1 for a second, because the title of chapter 1 is called Thoughts Are Things. And I can't stress to you enough in my life how much I believe that. I read this book when I was 25 years old, and that chapter 1 title has stuck with me this entire time. Thoughts are things. What we think about ends up manifesting itself into our lives, good, bad, or otherwise. And that's why it's really important to try to keep your guardrails on. And that's why I always end these videos saying to please stay positive, because it's important. The more you can think positively about stuff, I know it might seem a little bit superficial to just go be positive. I'm not really suggesting that. What I'm saying, though, is that thoughts are things. And if you can continuously think more positively than negatively, you may find that things tend to work out a little bit more in your favor than otherwise. And I think that's going to get me to the one for the road today. And the one for the road is going to be very short, and it's going to be about positive guideposts. So I made this video with the idea in mind of talking to you guys about books that have been formative for me. But as I was compiling this list, what I realized was that when I think back on life in a lot of situations, I'm not one of those people that say, oh, I have no regrets. That's not true. I regret a ton of decisions that I've made. And one thing that I'm not particularly great at is remembering the good decisions that I made or the good paths that I chose to take. I'm always kind of self-thinking sometimes, oh, I should have gone this way or I should have gone that way instead of the way that I did. And what this video really brought out for me, and what I want to say in this one for the road for you, is to think back into your life, not so much on the bad paths or the regretful paths, but on the guidepost paths. The guideposts that you stopped at, saw what the sign was, felt energized, and moved into a direction for yourself that worked out, or that maybe made you a better human being than you were before you got to that guidepost. I know that's a little bit abstract. I wanted to keep that short today, but that's the challenge. Think back on some of those guideposts in your life, whether they're books, whether it's something else in media, whether it's a person, whatever it is. Let's, instead of thinking about regretful stuff just for an afternoon or an evening or a morning, think about some of the positive ones that have given us some of the things that we have in life that maybe sometimes when we look in the mirror, we take for granted because we're not remembering the things that got us to good places. That's my one for the road. I'd love to know in the comments, what were your guidepost books on the way, right? Which were some of the books that were formative, not only for you as a reader, but kind of guided you a little bit throughout beyond your reading life? I will meet you in the comments. We're going to talk there. I can't believe I shot this entire video without editing it. Yeah, you know, my voice cracked a couple of times. But that's okay. You guys are here for unedited videos. That's what I've got. Everybody, like I mentioned before, stay positive. And of course, here's your fortune.